Okay, I'm going to record this and put it out on Discord because Naomi came and saw me last night. Now, this is actually the day that we're talking about here is the day before your week 15 attendant learn together is due. So I really appreciated her coming to talk to me, and it spurred me thinking about how I was going to already cover this topic. I'm just showing you kind of the current date as we're right here on the 29th. But her questions about how to do this made me realize that it would probably be good just to cover it in a video that gives those students looking to take this pathway to Dev 2 to give them an example. Because we didn't really see an example of how to refactor. And in this case, I didn't really qualify how much of your code you need to refactor. So now I can because I did it. I actually worked through it myself. Now, I will tell you, I used a previous student's example. Motzen, who took my class this time last year, gave me probably what I've had so far the best example of how to actually not just do a class implementation for whatever you're getting as far as the user input, doing whatever calculations and using a class implementation for that, but also using a class implementation for handling everything that happens after that. And so what I would say here is at minimum, you want to have a class for that represents what the user input is, and then whatever calculation you're doing to that. And then when you actually set up the object, which we've normally done in the past, that's when you would call new. And I'll show you somewhat my example of how I did it. Right. And then so that would be one of your class, and then the other class would be called a store class. The difference is going to be on the second one, the store class. It would be a JavaScript, what we call still a class, but you're going to use a static variable or a static designation on a class. And this allows you to really just have a class that has a utility functions, okay? And this allows you to basically take the code that was in your functions and put them where it makes sense in your store. And I think store is probably a good word for this, okay? So, and then just have static methods inside of that store class. So the difference is, well, let me just show you now that I've talked about it. Here's my Dev 2 example that I've mostly finished, at least getting it converted over to a class. So this is what I was saying. Now I have two event listeners that is both that it represents first my quick entry and then my more detailed entry, but basically they're doing the same thing. But I gather all the pieces that I need to instantiate a new object and calling new for me entry, and then passing it all of the variables I have gotten or declared in order to instantiate a new object. And then I call, and I'm actually going to change this. This was just me kind of getting it done. Because one of the things we learned in the last part of the class concepts coverage from Andrew was how you can use a setter. So what I immediately do is call cost, which is a method I have on my class, but I could just actually have the setter handle this because I'll always want to, once I instantiate it, actually determine the cost. That's here nor there, just FYI, when you look at mine, that's why you see that. Now, so at this point, everything I captured and then whatever needed to happen with the input data that I gathered, right, then those inputs become the parameters for my new substantiated entry for me. And those can be handled, like I said, and I'll show you in a minute my classes file, my classes.js. And then once I do that, because up here, and this is where I was transitioning to before these event listeners get set up, I've already gone out and said get saved entries, which this is basically what we've seen before. But the difference here is I'm calling store. This is what I was referring to by having a class that just has static methods that can handle all the utilities of the entries. Okay, so because in this case we are acting on one specific, you're instantiating an object that you have methods on. And this idea of static could be used also in here, but it doesn't make sense because you're still not conceptually removing the idea that this was one entry and then you're adding it to all of your entries, and then you want to run your typical, your render, your save and your render functions, right, which are utilities. So this is just a pretty, I think, helpful way to do this. Okay, so you can see up here, I use that to gather. Like I said before, I use this to render it. And then I used an entry class to gather, right? Remember, you also need to validate, but gather the inputs, update my instantiated object, my entry, and then push that into the main memory or the RAM memory of my code. But then I need to store that in local storage and render based on my new entries. Okay. So let me just move before I do this, actually, before I show you my classes, I want to tell you that the functions that we all have been like using this structure, I ended up moving all of this code into my classes, right? Now, I don't recommend doing this all in one fell swoop. I don't think that's a good idea. I did it pieces at a time, so I had a better understanding, right? So first I moved the things that I knew I was calling here, my saved entries, because because we're passing around this entries, which represents what's in local storage, right? We're actually not representing this entries in a class. We're just writing utility methods to handle that so they're organized in a static class. Okay, so again, I will no longer need functions because they're all going to be up in classes, but I just kept this around to show you the example. And I will say again, I recommend doing this a piece at a time because you really have to remember, and this is why I think this is a good exercise, is you have to kind of again think through what's happening in these render to, saving and rendering to the DOM. Okay, so let's come over to classes. So I have these rolled up right now, but what I did is instead of just having, as we saw on the order, I ended up doing just a file called classes. Okay. And then in it, I put my entry and I put my store. So this is all the class code for creating a new charging entry for me, for my EV charging tracking. And this is all the things that happen in my data store to both save it to local storage, remove an item from local storage, and then to render to the page from what is in main memory from local storage. Okay. So when you look at this, right, so here's my constructor. Here's my one method I have on here. And again, I'm going to change this because it just makes more sense to use a setter here. And it just makes, because I can actually have it as soon as it instantiates a new object. But I thought, well, for this example, I wanted to at least show you, right? And actually, I ended up using, I'll come back to this in a minute. Let me complete this thought. So that's my, right? That's the idea of my entry, my class that is created for each individual entry. But in this case, the class that I've created for all my functionality, again, kind of showing you the utility functions, I put in a class, and here was the thing, you call these methods static. right? So they're called on generally not just one instantiated object like here, but they are called on more than one or just utilities. And these really do fall into utilities. Okay. So again, the importance here is to kind of take your time, work through this code to understand. Don't just throw it all in there. I think that'll create a real challenge. But you can see my get saved entries. So I just show you here, right? So instead of before where I just called get saved entries because they were on functions, I put that function in my classes. I declared it with a static, meaning a static method, and then I called it on the store, that class that has all those static methods, and then just the method. Again, what we think of as a function name either is really true, but more true to call it a method, right? So in that case, and then I called store because I also put in render my EV data with what comes back, what is in what we call main storage, or in our RAM storage in this case, right? So and I know that we've been doing this a while, and sometimes it still is not clear, right? Because these represent what came back from us pulling the data, declaring a variable, and then storing all that local storage data. Again, we had to go through a JSON parse. Well, we can actually go look at it if we don't remember, right? So we're returning whatever we found in there with the JSON parse. Notice there was a try catch here. I thought that was great. And if it throws an error, if there's an error in here. Okay, so that's my example. I hope it helps. I'm also going to put Modson's example. I'll push this soon out on my public under demo. So, because his example is definitely more involved. His project was great. It was really fun. You're welcome to look at how he did this, right? And he's the one that he's the one that really, looking at his code, helped me understand a way to use these static methods. Now, his example also uses static methods inside of his instantiation of these objects as well. But this is where I got the idea. Where's this store? Down here, right here. Okay. So I'm just telling you, you're welcome to look at his as an example as well. Okay, so the last thing I'll say is, and I've said this before, but make sure you're validating beyond the required, beyond the type, the user input, right? And then this was the suggestion, and now you have a video that gives you more detail on actually how to handle this by doing a class for the user input and a different class for handling local storage. And I again want to really thank Modson for doing such an amazing job with that. Okay, hope this helps you. Let me know if you have any questions. Again, I'll post this out to Discord.